Hey, welcome to Gaming Without Parole. Across from me is Bryan Paul.
And across from me is Brett Zawilski.
Whoa! I can't play my games. They're all full of candy. I guess. I don't know. Bread.
But really, across from me, the ever-illustrious Mike Zeller.
Yep. Brian made me make fun of Brett.
No,
so it wouldn't seem one-sided.
It's totally one-sided. Mike likes Baldur's Gate, and we make fun of him for it.
I do like Baldur's Gate. Although I did stop playing it, actually, because I got so annoyed.
But why? Because you got sick of Baldur's Gate, or
yeah.
you got sick of us talking about
No,
you
because I
playing
got
Baldur's
sick
Gate?
of Baldur's Gate, because it just kind of really put me... Those old RPGs, you really have to stagger your saves so you don't get stuck somewhere.
Yeah. You need multiple saves.
Yes, yeah. And I got stuck somewhere. And I had staggered my saves, but I just had this moment of, that's still like 3 hours back. I don't want to do that shit.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
There are certain things about retro games I don't miss.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I would say both of us are maybe more retro enthusiasts than modern enthusiasts. But, yeah, like, there are definitely some great stuff that have happened in the last decade or so with video games.
Like, we wax poetic about, like, oh, the TurboGrafx graphics, and then why can't things have this, pixelated art style, this pixel art look, and then we get that, and then but we're like, oh, but you know what, we can save our games now, which is really nice.
Yeah, I definitely don't miss the vague objectives, the random difficulty spikes,
We talked a little bit about the things you would never find in certain games if you didn't have Nintendo Power.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's very, very true. Like, a lot of those games... I bet if we went through our collections, well, maybe not yours, but mine definitely, I've finished a lot fewer of my retro games than I have my modern. Like, there are games that I buy sometimes that I know of, like, I'm never going to see the end of this, but...
Yep. I don't buy games to play them, apparently.
Do you remember in Nintendo Power when in the back they used to have the section where you could take a picture of the end of the game and send it in as like, I beat this game.
Yeah.
It was so cool. Or they'd shame people though if they had because you had to have your system in the picture too to prove you actually did it.
Yeah.
And if they saw a Game Genie, they'd like circle it and be like, cheater, you bastard.
But also, wasn't it the ending screen? So, like, wasn't it like partial spoilers? Like, hey, well, maybe we shouldn't. Actually, no, that's something else. There was a different magazine that was like, it was like Game Over in the back. It was the Game Over section, and it would show you the end of a game.
Yeah.
Like, that's kind of bullshit, right? Isn't like the end of the game your reward for having beaten it?
But is that any different than like YouTube Let's Plays or things that people watch?
That's different. You watch the entire Let's Play to experience the game and to check it out and see what it's like. And then, hey, if you decided you're not going to buy it, let's watch it to the end. This just is like you turn the page and you're like, oh, spoiled.
Oh yeah,
fuck.
Yeah, that's what that was. What that section was called. It was just called "fuck spoiled."
What are we talking about this week, Mike?
Oh man. Well, you kind of hinted at it. I liked your subtle. It was like the very usual suspects where you drop the clues for what we were talking about ahead of time. We decided to talk about something.
Stardew Valley.
Yes.
No.
I don't know anything about that game.
No. When it comes to consoles, I'm going to play the crap out of it.
Yeah, it looks...
Harvest Moon for a new generation.
It looks like kind of sad Harvest Moon.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I don't want my games to be happy.
Brian is really a 14-year-old goth girl.
Yeah, that's not obvious from just looking at me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not trying to hide it.
Yeah.
I like Bright Eyes, My Chemical Romance.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm adorable.
Yes.
Moving on.
We decided to talk about something that's very near and dear to both of us, the TurboGrafx-16 / PC engine. Well, that'll be
next episode.
Next week. We're gonna do a two-parter really, which we'll see how that actually works out.
This is one of our favorite systems of all time. So the only way to really do this properly is to try to break it up a little bit, because otherwise this would be like a 2-hour episode.
Yeah.
So we got to do our best to break it up. Okay, I'm trying to remember what time we started at here, so we can know what time to end.
We're trying to be professionals here, folks.
A little.
So the Turbo, I think one of the reasons why it's we both have so much affection for it is because it is so much a collector's system. Like, this is not something that you roll into work and just start randomly talking to somebody, your age, and they're like, oh yeah, I remember that. Like, this is totally, when the TurboGrafx was, even when it was out, I don't think anybody really knew anything about it. I certainly never knew anybody that had it when I was a kid.
When I was in 6th grade, my friend Mickey, who, strangely enough, was the same kid that got me back on video games with Resident Evil 1 on PlayStation 1.
Good friend.
Whereas like all my friends had Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Genesis, he was like playing Bonk's Adventure. And he was like, guys, you don't get it. It's amazing. And I'm sure like there were nights where we went to his house and we're like, wow, this is cool. But it just felt so outside of our circle that I was like, how do I even get one of these?
Yeah, it had a real... I mean, when I was a kid, I remember being aware of it. Like, they had those demo stations set up in Toys R Us. And there was actually... when I was a kid, I was saving up to buy a Super Nintendo. And Super Nintendo at the time, I believe, was $120.
Wow.
And I had $60. My brother had $60. So I was like, well, I can buy the Super Nintendo with him and we'll have to share it.
Yeah.
Or they were selling TurboGrafx-16s.
Remember this.
For $60.
$60, right.
With like a ton of games.
Yeah.
A ton of games.
They were practically giving it away.
Yeah. And I was like, wow, that's pretty great. And some of that stuff looks pretty dope.
The TurboGrafx, I took some notes here, released on August 29th, 1989 in the States. The reason they were giving it away practically was because they probably just had a lot of excess inventory.
It did not sell well. No market penetration.
It seems like, from the numbers I could gather on the internet, it sold in the States 2.5 million units, compared to roughly 20 million Sega Genesis and 23 million Super Nintendo. That's a huge difference. That's like 10% of the market share.
Yeah.
That's insane. I do remember going to stores.
Well, that's less than 10%, because if you're saying about, round it up, say about 50 million units sold total.
Oh, sorry.
That's two.
10, I think 10% of each Sega.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah, that's a tiny percentage.
Absolutely right. But I do remember going into stores and being like, what are these? And then if you ever saw the games, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but they came on like little credit card size
it was
cartridges.
Weird.
And they were so cool. Nintendo had these big bulky cartridges, which even at the time those were cool. Super Nintendo, even Genesis. But then you get these little things that you could literally carry around in your pocket, in your wallet, credit card size.
Yeah, and visually the games themselves had a pretty unique style to them too. Like, if you play a TurboGrafx game, you can tell pretty quickly, like, this is not a Nintendo game, this is not a Genesis game, this is very much a Turbo game.
It had that sort of right in between Nintendo and Genesis look to it.
Yeah.
Where the sprites could be bigger but not really more detailed.
Yeah.
Yeah. It always and a lot of games had that distinct, bright, colorful palette.
Yeah.
Because it could display more colors. And it was called the TurboGrafx-16. I remember even on the schoolyard back then, people were like, it's not 16-bit. And it technically wasn't. It had an 8-bit CPU, but it did have a 16-bit video display controller and a 16-bit video color encoder. So there are multiple reasons to call it the TurboGrafx-16, even if a little bit unfairly. Although Nintendo 64... we probably have a whole conversation about that too.
Yeah.
And the Atari Jaguar.
Yeah. So I don't, going back a little bit to our affection for it.
Right.
I don't know about you, but for me, when I really realized, like, okay, I'm getting into game collecting, like that's when the Turbo kind of hoved into view. It wasn't. When I was in college, I went around buying a lot of like Super Nintendo games that I didn't have when I was a kid, but it was more just like, I've got a little bit more money.
Yeah.
I'm in college, so I've got a ton of time. I can finally play these. That it was never a case of like, I always wanted a Turbo and I just never got around to it. It was like, oh, hey, what is this thing? I have these vague, almost dreamlike memories of it.
Yeah, like I remember Bonk having that commercial on TV. And he was like, I don't know, I think they were pretty. I think they were pretty forward with their advertising, very aggressive with their advertising, almost like where a Bonk. I can sort of remember Bonk like smashing his head against like the competition.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, no, I definitely remember most of my memories of the Turbo, I think, are of Bonk. That was kind of like, it's that caveman system.
But I didn't really get, like, when I was about 21 or so, and I had, if I had some time in my life, like you were saying, I was just out of college, but, it's when I joined GameFAQs, and you ran into other collectors who were like, and they're talking about the TurboGrafx quite a bit. And even at that time, things weren't that expensive for the TurboGrafx. That was 15 years ago, for anyone keeping track. You could definitely get a lot of very cool games for like $10 each. So I think in the last 15 years, things have definitely spiraled out of control.
Yeah, the Turbo is up there with, I would say, the Saturn as one of the main collector's systems. Like, at this point, if you're not ready to dump a serious chunk of change, it's not even worth it. You're not going to be able to get much of anything.
Yeah, I don't say this very often, but if you haven't done it already, then maybe you shouldn't.
Yeah.
I'm never going to collect the Neo Geo. I've been priced out of that since pretty much day one.
I mean, the Neo Geo was always
right.
I mean, they sold those games at I think like $200 a pop.
Or even more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Depending on which the game was. Yeah, so I've been priced out of that forever, and I have no desire to get into it. But this, you can still find certain games for decent prices. They're not going to be the best games, but there are, strangely, quite a few hidden gems.
Oh yeah. It's like the Saturn. It's very much one of those undiscovered country kind of systems. I import a fair amount, and so I do have a lot of Japanese games, but there's still like depths to the Japanese libraries of both the Turbo and the Saturn that I've just never explored. And even the American library, what we were going to talk about in this episode, there's a lot of stuff that it's just okay, I've never heard of this game before.
So where do you want to start in terms of games? You want to start with the launch titles?
Well, we can do that. I mean, I was thinking Bonk.
Okay, not a launch title.
No, I didn't think it was.
Yeah. But definitely the mascot.
Yeah, I mean, Bonk, like we said, is kind of he's the guy on that system, little caveman guy. And I was kind of waxing poetic about Bonk as I was taking my notes for this episode. And I think the great thing about the Bonk games is when you play a lot of Nintendo platformers and then you play other non-Nintendo platformers, you can tell the difference. I mean, there's definitely a reason why Mario and Samus and the like, and Donkey Kong are held in such high regards, because those games are really well done.
Yep.
I think Bonk is one of the few game series where you play those games and you're like, yeah, these are good. Like, these are really good. I can see why they picked these to hang their hat on. They're not quite Mario level good, but they're really solid games.
Yeah, again, it's got that classic TurboGrafx color palette where it's
there's like dead bugs on this glass.
What?
It's gone now.
Oh no. Like, that showed up in the mail like 2 days ago.
Oh.
Yeah, I rinsed it out. I didn't know there was dead bugs in it. I haven't
Straight from Indonesia.
I hadn't used it.
I worked at this company one time where we used to get boxes of shoes from Indonesia, and they would sometimes have the biggest goddamn bugs you ever saw in these boxes.
Mike used to work in a sweatshop.
No, they were coming from the sweatshops, what we were getting.
Sweatshop to sweatshop. Big bugs. Bonk had that, like I said, typical TurboGrafx-16 color palette. It was definitely a great looking game.
Yeah, oh yeah.
It scrolled real smoothly. The controls were interesting because you could jump and then do a headbutt attack, or you could just do a standing headbutt attack on the ground. But if you switch that turbo switch up, then you could jump and then hold down the headbutt, and you do a spin attack in the air, and you basically float across the screen.
Yeah, pretty much the easiest way to get through the original Bonk's adventure was to just jump as high as you could and like pinwheel to the end of the level. Yeah,
the way.
Just avoiding everything. They did in the later games, in Bonk's Revenge and Bonk 3
Bonk's
or Bonk's
Big
Second
Adventure.
Big Adventure, they did finally gimp that because they're like, this kind of completely breaks the game.
I think Bonk was a great technical showpiece too, because if anyone got into TurboGrafx, it was when Bonk came around.
Yeah.
And it didn't take long to get to that first end level boss, where he just took up a majority of the screen, and there wasn't a lot of animation to him, but he was bouncing around. And you're like, holy crap! You can't do this on a Nintendo.
Yeah,
you might not be able to do it on a Genesis.
Yeah, I mean, it had a similar feel. Those early boss battles, it did have a similar feel to like the Robotnik fights in the Sonic games.
Yeah,
which that's what they were. They were these big technical showpieces. Those are clearly a more intricate affair. There was more animation, there was more going on there. But it did have that kind of wow factor of fighting those bosses, and they were decent fights too. Like they had some technical skill to them other than just being big graphic showpieces.
Yeah. And although I do think the gameplay, it might have been better gameplay technically, but by the time Bonk 3 rolled around, it seemed like they just took gimmicks. Like you could become Wicked Big Bonk, and he'd be like half of the screen.
Yeah.
And didn't control well, of course, because how do you control something that big? And so it was almost like we'll show you what we can do with our system, sort of thing.
Yeah. When Bonk. Was it Super Bonk for the Super Nintendo? When after
I forgot about that.
Yeah, after everybody was all worked up when Sonic games finally started appearing on Nintendo consoles, but Bonk was kind of the first sad mascot to slowly, sheepishly limp his way onto a competitor's console. So Super Bonk was sort of a tweaked port of Bonk 3. It wasn't totally the same game, but they took a lot of the elements from Bonk 3 and made it into a Super Nintendo game. And I remember, even at the time I played it, I was kind of like, this feels a little played out.
Yeah, and there was actually a Super Bonk 2.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Which real played out.
Yeah.
But so let's tackle the actual launch games. I'm not sure if there'll be much to talk about here. Actually, maybe there are. And this might not be the whole list, but I think it is. Alien Crush.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, still holds up.
Yeah.
As one of the best pinball games ever made.
Yeah, I think right after Zonk, right after Bonk and Zonk, which I'm sure we can get to, I had the Crush pinball series as those are kind of, if you're going to talk about if you're going to talk about two other games for the TurboGrafx, I think it's going to be Splatterhouse and Alien Crush.
Okay.
But the two Crush pinball games, that and Devil's Crush, are great, and they hold up really, like you said, really well.
And surprisingly so, considering that Alien Crush the screen doesn't scroll.
No.
It actually blinks to black and then changes. It's 3 screens, right?
Yeah, I think all of those Crush pinball games are 3 screens.
And it's just and it's jarring at first, but man, you get used to it real fast. It's still really well done considering you have to deal with that technical limitation.
Yeah.
And I wonder why that was the case. It's a pinball game. It should scroll.
Yeah, there must have been some kind of technical issues at the time that they hadn't quite worked out. I'm pretty sure Devil's Crush does scroll.
Oh, it
smoothly.
does.
And their third. Their Black Sheep Jockey Crush for the Super Famicom is a very smooth scrolling game.
Yeah, obviously the pinball games have changed quite a bit over the years. Zen Pinball 2 is an amazing platform for pinball games. It's on PlayStation. You can just download a new table for a couple bucks here and there, and it's amazing. But there's something missing, like the 2D sprite based.
Yeah,
it's just so good, and even for being not a huge pinball game fan, I think they're so much fun to play.
Yeah, well, what they did really well is they worried less about, say, perfect ball physics and recreating the real pinball experience, and they really tried to combine what makes a video game good with what makes pinball good. It's a very visceral game. There's always a lot going on. There's a lot of explosions. The very Geiger-esque art style.
Very true, yeah.
Makes, it clear all of these games were kind of rip-offs of other things. So, it was very I don't want to say gory because that's not exactly true, but there was a lot of like splatter and things bursting into goo and
it felt very biological.
Yeah, and it did that really well. It provided some of that same visceral thrill that you get from a pinball. I think that's what a lot of people like about pinball is how physical it feels. You feel the ball rumbling around, the bumpers, you can kind of feel that, and you get that similar, but it's in a very video game way.
Totally agree. China Warrior.
Yeah, that's not a great one.
Well, China Warrior is a game, and this never happens. China Warrior is a game that has actually gotten a better reputation over time.
Really?
Yeah, because it's garbage. Right?
Oh,
Look,
it's
check this out, right? So, as you can see...
yeah. Whoa.
Your character's gigantic, right? And it does not control very well. And there's just shit being thrown at you from off screen, like sometimes high, sometimes
it's a triple
low.
threat.
And then and then enemies that you can just knock out with one punch or one kick. The whole thing doesn't seem to work very well because it's obviously just a technical showpiece. Yeah. Like, look at these huge sprites.
It's got the real Altered Beast feel.
But defenders have come in, especially over the last few years, and they're like, "There's more to this game." Like nothing lying underneath, its exterior, but if you have to consider it more of a shooter. They say it's about memorization, and when you play it that way, you'll get a new appreciation for it. You'd be like, okay, at that point you play it with your eyes closed. You'd be like, duck, duck, punch, and you just start like memorizing where everything is, and it's just like this whole string, because nothing's random.
Yeah,
you remember where everything is. So I've tried to do that, but I've got like 3 brain cells left. And could not remember anything.
That kind of makes me think of like competitive arcade game scene.
Yeah.
Did you ever see that document? You must have, King of Kong.
Oh, so good.
Yeah, with the Donkey Kong stuff, where he's got the wet dry marker and he's got all the lines and stuff drawn on the arcade machine that he's using at home because everything is the same. So you just memorize it, just this, and this. I can get it. I get why people are attracted to that. That's totally not anything I'm interested in at all. Yeah.
Dungeon Explorer.
Oh, that was a launch game? Really? Yeah. Wow. That's a pretty okay game.
Sort of a Zelda ripoff.
Yeah.
Sort of a Gauntlet ripoff.
Yeah, more of a Gauntlet ripoff. It's got a little bit more depth. I think there's like an inn you can walk around, you can talk to people, and there's a password save or something, isn't there, I think?
Yeah, graphically really dark and dingy.
Yeah.
It was not a showcase title.
No.
But it was multiple players, right? Was this a turbo tap thing where you could?
I believe so. I'm not 100% on that.
Yeah, I'm not either.
Don't quote us.
Okay.
Were you
going
to say more about Dungeon Explorers?
No.
Well,
I was going to try to speed things up.
Sorry. Well, just because you're talking about Dungeon Explorers.
Yeah.
Dungeon Explorers 2, one of the first games to get super expensive for the Turbo. And actually supposedly a pretty decent game. So
Bit of reproduction of it.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah, there's a company out there who I don't know the name of. I'll throw it up there. Who does very high quality, indistinguishable from the real one, reproductions. And for somebody like me who doesn't mind reproductions and just kind of wants to have it in their collection, they do a really good job. Yeah. Keith Courage in Alpha Zones.
Yeah, that's.
This was based on an anime, right? In Japan, is that right? There's actually a story behind it.
Yeah, I think so. It has such a bad reputation. Yeah. I never really bothered to investigate any further, but I do think you're right. I think it's some licensed thing in Japan.
Have you played it at all?
No.
So I played it the other night. I was like, it's funny because it kind of looks nice. Like it looks.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
It's like a decent platformer, and you just walk around, you swing your sword in this little 2D environment, walking from left to right. And there's shops where you can buy bombs and you can buy armor. There's a noise in here that there's like a fly around, and I can't place where he is. It's gonna drive me nuts.
It's that one that was on my glass.
maybe he brought him back to life.
Yeah.
Are you Jesus?
Not the last time I checked though.
Well, maybe it's time to check again.
Okay.
And then every level alternates with this mech thing that you get into. So and then everything moves really fast, and you're suddenly almost more of a shooter stage, the way the enemies come at you, and then it's really jarring to go back every odd stage to the platforming because it's so slow and nothing really ever gets exciting. It's one of those games where it's like there's nothing wrong with it, but there's nothing good about it.
Yeah, and as we've discovered, like you were saying about China Warrior, people can develop an affection for games that are real shitty.
Yep.
It's the real mediocre stuff that ends up kind of with the worst reputation.
What were your feelings on Legendary Axe?
Legendary Axe. So you mean prehistoric Castlevania?
Yes.
Yeah, Legendary Axe is actually pretty solid.
Yeah.
It's not quite. It's just a tick below the quality level design of, say, a Castlevania. But that's saying a lot. Like, it's still a very, very solid game, and it's very clearly a ripoff of Castlevania.
It is.
But it's got a neat feel to it. You don't really see a whole lot of like prehistoric games.
No.
And it does it pretty well. Like, it's got a good consistent visual style and a good tone to it. Yeah.
Balls hard.
Oh yeah. I mean, in the similar vein to Castlevania, I would say it very rarely feels cheap.
Okay. Yeah, I've gone into that game so many times with the intention of beating it, and I think I did one time, only by cheating. Yeah, I think using save states through an emulator. Yeah, pretty hard.
Yeah, no, it's a very difficult game. The sequel, clearly not inspired by this whatever was going. It clearly a Conan the Barbarian knockoff.
Was it even the same developer?
I believe it was this. Well,
because, or let me ask you this: in Japan, was it actually Legendary Axe 2?
I think so, but I believe it was one of those cases where they had a game that was basically done, and they're like, oh, Legendary Axe sold pretty well, this is going to be Legendary Axe 2.
Got it.
Because you're right, it totally, well, I mean, there's some gameplay similarities,
but if you put them side by side, you would never say, well, this is obviously the sequel to this.
Yeah, I mean, because the first one is prehistoric Castlevania, and the second one is Conan the Barbarian knockoff, like, all the way. I think the ending screen is even the same as the ending shot from the original Conan the Barbarian.
Wow.
With him on the throne with the sword, and there's actually I've never been to the end of that. Or did I beat that game? It's not that one is a significantly easier game than the first one.
I beat Legendary Axe 2.
Yeah. There's like surprising full frontal nudity at the end of that game.
I don't remember that. I was 21, probably drunk.
Yeah. Yeah.
Although I'm not sure how I beat it if I was drunk. R-Type.
Really? That was a launch title?
Yeah. According to some website I found. I could be wrong on all these. I mean, it was just...
this is... Once you go back a certain amount of time, it's very hard to find out some of these bits of information.
Yeah. R-Type just looked really good.
Yeah.
The downside is the TurboGrafx has, I think, an unfair reputation for being the 2D side-scrolling shmup system. There are a lot of them.
Yeah.
But there are, I mean, this is the first one we've talked about so far. You know, and we've already talked about a lot of good games.
I don't have a ton of them on my list either.
I don't either, because, like, we'll talk about, let's just talk about it now. No, we'll talk about it later. So, because there might be a lot of them, that doesn't mean there's a lot of good ones.
Yeah.
So, R-Type is a classic. R-Type's on everything.
Yeah, that Gradius are kind of nose and nose.
Yeah, R-Type's, is, I think for the time, probably the best version of R-Type you could find.
Yeah, I don't have much to say about R-Type.
Also, we're just going to skim over the rest. Victory Run, which was a driving game.
Okay.
Power Golf, which was a space adventure game.
It was a hentai dating game. Yeah.
And Vigilante, which was a really crappy brawler.
Yeah. That was technically the first of the Kunio / River City Ransom games. Oh wait, no, that's Renegade. I'm sorry,
You're right.
That mixed up. Yeah, Vigilante.
I always
is
get those
something
mixed
different.
up too.
Yeah, Vigilante was Vigilante like Trojan? Was that? Yeah, not very good though.
But now I have a fucking crazy list of all non-launch games that need to be mentioned. Do you have anything you'd like to talk about first? Because I think you've got the same idea going on over here.
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of I figured we'd just see where the conversation went.
Throw out a game you like to talk about.
Well, since we talked about Bonk, at some point they decided that they needed like a successor to Bonk or something. They needed to ratchet up their marketing against this rascally Sonic the Hedgehog fella. So they came out with Zonk.
Air Zonk.
Air Zonk, yeah.
Like
and
a cooler dude version of Bonk.
Yeah, but it's clear that they thought the whole thing was a giant joke.
Yeah.
Because like everything has sunglasses on it, and It's actually a really great game. It's a horizontal shooter. It's one of the other ones that I have on my list, and it's got this great. It's like I think they call them cute 'em ups when they're these adorable shoot 'em ups, where you play as this basically Bonk mixed with Astro Boy with a little lightning bolt on his head, and you just fly around blasting like robot dinosaurs and stuff.
It is funny to see how fast that game moves and how huge some of the sprites are.
Yeah.
It is, I mean, graphically probably the epitome of the TurboGrafx system.
Yeah. It's got a great the speed is one thing, but it's also got multi-layer parallax scrolling, which is really, really good.
Yeah.
It's a gorgeous
expensive
game. Yeah, that was actually I bought 2 Turbo games before I owned my system, and that was one of them because
Really?
I saw it for $20.
Wow.
It just popped up and I bought it immediately.
Now, there are 2 versions of this game. There's a HuCard version, which is just Air Zonk, and then there's the Super CD version, which is Super Air Zonk.
Super Air Zonk is a different game.
Oh.
Yep, it's a sequel.
It's also way more expensive.
Yes, and it's not as good from what I never even really bothered looking for it because it doesn't have any of the parallax scrolling. The sprites are all smaller. I think it was a different team that worked on it. Yeah, I don't know if it was technically a different developer, but it was not the same group that made it.
It's been so expensive for so long for me that I just haven't even looked into it because I'm like, I'm just never going to be able to afford this.
Yeah, that was when you had talked about how when you got into Turbo stuff, it was still sort of affordable.
Yeah.
When I got in, I think was the very tail end of that because I bought up a bunch of stuff and then I was like, oh, guess I'm not buying anything else.
When I got into buying for the TurboGrafx for a solid year or 2, maybe 2 years or longer, every common game, Blazing Lasers, Bonk's Adventure, Bonk's Revenge, Bloody Wolf, Ninja Spirit, all these games were like 10 Legendary Axe, $10 to $20, complete in box with the Hue sleeve, with the Hue card, just mint condition, $20, and it was just like a collector's dream at that point. Like, I'm just gonna scoop up all of these, and years later, I sold some of my collection, decided that it was I think maybe like 5-6 years ago. I decided that I wanted my collection back. And it's a much different marketplace now.
It's totally insane. I mean, there's still, like you said at the beginning, there's still a few little things you can pick up, inexpensively, but it's brutal. I mean, everything's crazy expensive.
Bloody Wolf was their response to Contra.
Yep. That's like a top-down shooter, though.
A little isometric. It's from the side. From the perspective of the side, but you can move up and down in the stage, so it almost resembles more like a Final Fight game. And then the perspective does change occasionally, to where it is a top down and you're going straight up the screen. Really weird game. It's I don't even know if I like it. Right, but I've played it a million times, and it's good.
It's got that Stockholm syndrome going for it.
Yeah, it just doesn't. It's something for the people who had TurboGrafx that couldn't play Contra. Yeah. I think that was really its entire purpose in life.
We haven't even really touched upon, because when you started talking about Bloody Wolf, I was going to mention another game, but we haven't touched upon the fact that the other thing that kind of made the Turbo such a weird system when we were kids is that there were like a million different versions of it. And as far as I know, this predated all the weird stuff that Sega did with the Genesis.
Yes, it did.
So there was the core TurboGrafx system, or if you were in Japan, the PC Engine. You could take off the whole like back section, and there was this big port that you could latch a CD drive onto.
Yeah.
But you couldn't just play CD games. You also needed a special card to go into the slot.
Yep.
And there were like multiple versions of the card. And some CD games wouldn't work with certain cards.
Yeah. I think at least 3 different cards.
Yeah.
And
yeah, there was like 1.0, 2.0, and then arcade. Was that the last one?
I honestly don't know, because I think outside of my Retro Freak gaming console that I use now for the Hue cards, the only turbo system I've ever owned was the Turbo Duo.
Yeah.
Which is the don't worry about a thing. We got this all under one roof console, which had the CD drive, which had the Hue card slot, and all this everything was compatible. The only thing you couldn't do was play Japanese arcade games.
Yeah, I think you needed. You couldn't play Japanese card games either. There was a different connection pin. So,
but there were like the Kisato, and different types of adapters.
Yeah, you could buy adapters that I think those are still kind of reasonably priced.
There are people still making them.
Yeah.
The Kisato is specifically very expensive, but the one I have is from, I think, Telegames in the UK, and I think they're still making them. And like, I mean, it's a little expensive to import, but for $50 you can get a brand new one. I don't think they make Kisatos anymore, so you'd be spending a lot of money. Where the fuck is that fly?
I think it's behind you, actually.
It is.
I think it's behind the green
it's
screen.
Moving around.
God. yeah.
So now that you've introduced the CD system, we can talk about some CD games.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to say one other thing about the Turbo Duo that you mentioned.
Yeah.
It's a really nice looking system, too. Like, if you see it nowadays, it doesn't look particularly dated or clunky compared to some of the other older, CD based. Yeah. It's a very sleek system. Notoriously, like a lot of old CD technology, notoriously finicky, which is such a bad combo because these things are wicked expensive, and they were even back when we got into it.
Your CD drive's broken, and I think what are the things inside that break down?
It's like sound plugs or something.
There's a sound thing, but there's something in these consoles that were just faulty from the get-go.
Yeah, that's the caps or something. Yes. It's something with the sound. Yeah.
And so when I plug mine in, it's very finicky. It's very finicky when I plug the AV cord into it. It's like if I just tap it the right way, everything works perfectly. But if it moves at all, you're going to get a messy signal or a bad sound. And there are people who fix these things. Yeah. But they're few and far between,
and it ain't cheap.
No. Although I found one guy who was super cheap, but no longer in business.
Yeah.
Everyone else killed him.
Correlation between that. Yeah. When I was in graduate school, it was like the most brutal part of my graduate career, and my Xbox 360 died right after I finished Bayonetta, and I was like, whatever, I don't give a shit. Like I'm done with Bayonetta. I'm not gonna touch this thing again for a while. It was either the same day or that same week. I was tinkering with the Turbo Duo, and the CD drive just stopped. And I remember I just laid down on the floor and stared up at the ceiling, and I was there for hours. My girlfriend at the time came back from wherever she had been and was just like, "Are you okay?" And I'm just like, "No, no, I'm not." Yeah, I actually, prepping for this, I dug around a little bit, and I've been sort of tentatively reaching out to some people that might be able to fix it, and I'm just like, I need to get this fixed. I want to go back to playing some of these games again. They're so good.
So I have a proposition for you.
Okay.
We're about a half an hour in. We're about not even halfway through the games I've got listed here. How about we make the TurboGrafx episode 2 parts?
I think that is a very fine idea.
And maybe the PC Engine will be a single episode.
Yeah, I think that is a very fine idea.
All right, so let's call it quits right here, and we'll see you next week.
We will.
For the other half of this episode.
Next week.
Right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, then let's get the fuck out of here.
Yeah, I'm tired. I'm getting real sweaty, too.
Yeah, we're going to be sweaty for another half hour.
I know.
We're going to be wearing the same clothes next week, too.
I know. We're scuzzy like that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
I guess this has been Gaming Without Parole.
Yeah, across from me is how we do this?
I don't know, man.
Brett Zawilski.
Yeah, I hate that guy.
Yep. Go play some Overwatch. Yeah, love you, Brett.
Yeah.
This is Mike Zeller.
And this is Brian Paul.
We'll see you next week.
Bye.